Sir, you need to leave before this turns into a bigger problem. The words cut through the quiet hum of the Maple Street diner just as thunder rolled across the Georgia sky. Rain tapped against the front windows, and the red neon sign outside painted the wet parking lot with a soft glow. Every booth in the small diner seemed full that evening. Truck drivers warmed their hands around coffee mugs. Families shared slices of pie. Travelers escaping the storm looked for a hot meal and a dry place to rest. In the corner booth near the window sat a man in a worn brown jacket with a simple baseball cap resting on the table. His name was Graham Whitaker, although nobody in the diner knew it. To everyone else, he looked like an ordinary customer who had wandered in from the rain. Officer Dale Mercer stood beside the booth with his arms folded across his chest. The local police officer had been called after another customer complained about an argument over a dinner bill. Graham looked up calmly. I have already explained that I was charged for a meal I did not order. I only asked someone to check the receipt. Officer Mercer nodded toward the front door. We can talk about it outside. The customer who had started the complaint sat quietly at the next booth, avoiding eye contact. A few people looked toward Graham with suspicion. Others looked back down at their food, deciding the whole thing was none of their business. Behind the counter, Keisha Monroe balanced a silver coffee pot in one hand and a stack of clean cups in the other. At 26 years old, the black waitress had worked enough evening shifts to know that people often reached conclusions before they reached the truth. She had served Graham coffee earlier that night. He had thanked her politely and even asked about the homemade peach pie. She had watched the entire misunderstanding unfold. Another customer had picked up the wrong order. Graham had simply pointed out the mistake when the bill arrived. Somehow, the confusion had grown into an uncomfortable scene. Ron Haskins, the diner manager, hurried toward the booth with an anxious expression. Officer, I hope we can clear this up quickly. We do not need any trouble tonight. Graham looked at Ron with quiet surprise. I have not caused any trouble. I only asked someone to check the bill. Ron forced a nervous smile. I understand, sir, but maybe it would be easier if everyone just moved on. Keisha felt a knot tighten in her chest. Easier for who? She wondered. Outside, lightning flashed across the dark sky. Inside, the diner had become strangely quiet. Forks stopped moving. Coffee cups rested on tables. A little boy looked at his mother and whispered a question she pretended not to hear. Officer Mercer took one step closer to the booth. Sir, I am asking you one more time to come with me and sort this out. Graham slowly stood. He picked up his old jacket and looked around the diner. For a brief second, his eyes met Keisha's across the room. She expected to see anger or frustration. Instead, she saw disappointment. Not because of the bill. Not because of the misunderstanding. He looked disappointed that an entire room full of people had watched the truth happen and decided silence was easier. Keisha gripped the handle of the coffee pot a little tighter. Ron quietly shook his head at the staff as though warning them to stay out of the situation. The customers looked away. Officer Mercer waited by the door. Graham took one slow step forward. Then Keisha looked down at the receipt still resting on the counter, remembered exactly what she had seen only minutes before, and realized that if she stayed quiet, the biggest mistake of the evening would not belong to the man walking toward the door. It would belong to everyone else who knew the truth and said nothing. Keisha Monroe looked down at the receipt resting on the counter and then back at Graham Whitaker standing near the front door of the Maple Street diner. Rain continued to fall outside, and the sound against the windows seemed louder now that the conversations inside had disappeared. Officer Dale Mercer waited patiently with one hand resting on his belt. Ron Haskins stood behind the counter wiping his hands with a kitchen towel, hoping the uncomfortable moment would end before more customers decided to leave. Graham picked up his old jacket and prepared to walk toward the door without another argument. Keisha remembered exactly what had happened. She had carried a cheeseburger and fries to the booth beside Graham. Another customer had waved her over, asking for extra coffee. While she turned away for only a few seconds, the plates had been switched by mistake. Graham had noticed the error when the bill arrived and politely asked if someone could check it. The other customer had immediately insisted that Graham was trying to avoid paying. The misunderstanding had grown faster than anyone bothered to slow down. Officer Mercer looked at Graham. Sir, we can settle this outside and keep things calm for everyone. Graham nodded politely. I have tried to stay calm since the beginning. Keisha could hear the disappointment in his voice again. It was not the voice of someone looking for a fight. It sounded like someone who had stopped expecting people to listen. Ron glanced toward Keisha and the rest of the staff. Stay focused on your tables, everyone. We will handle this. Keisha looked at the receipt one more time. The order number was written clearly across the top. She remembered serving the meals herself. She remembered the customer who had switched the plates. She remembered Graham asking for nothing more than a fair explanation. A little boy sitting with his family looked toward the front of the diner and quietly asked his father why the man had to leave. His father looked uncomfortable and told him to finish his dinner. The question stayed with Keisha. Why did the man have to leave? She placed the coffee pot down on the counter. Her hands felt steady even though her heart was beating faster. Ron noticed immediately. Keisha, stay out of this. She looked at her manager. Sir, I served that table. Ron shook his head. We do not need more confusion. Officer Mercer glanced toward her. Did you see what happened? The entire diner seemed to stop breathing. Keisha looked at Graham. He did not say a word. He did not ask for help. He simply waited. Keisha looked back at the officer. Yes, sir. I saw everything. Ron stepped closer. Keisha, think about what you were doing. She nodded politely. I am. Officer Mercer waited for her to continue. Keisha pointed toward the receipt. The meals were switched by accident. The gentleman did not ask to leave without paying. He only asked us to check the order. I brought the food to the tables. I remember exactly where it went. The customer at the next booth shifted nervously in his seat. Several people turned to look at him for the first time. Linda Hayes, a regular customer who visited the diner almost every evening, slowly raised her hand. I saw part of it too, she said. I think the young lady is right. Another guest looked up from his coffee. I remember seeing the plates moved. Ron looked around the diner in surprise. Officer Mercer looked at Graham and then back at Keisha. You are certain about what you saw? Keisha nodded. Yes, sir. I am not trying to cause trouble. I just do not think he should be blamed for something he did not do. Graham looked at Keisha with quiet gratitude, but remained silent. The rain outside continued to fall, while the small diner filled with an even heavier silence. One honest voice had become two, then three. Standing behind the counter, Keisha suddenly realized that telling the truth had not changed the room because she was fearless. It had changed the room because someone had finally been brave enough to speak first. Officer Dale Mercer looked around the Maple Street diner as the silence settled over the room. Only a few minutes earlier, everyone had seemed certain about what had happened. Now the story sounded very different. Keisha Monroe stood behind the counter with her hands folded together, hoping her voice had been steady enough. She had simply told the truth, nothing more and nothing less. Linda Hayes, the regular customer who visited almost every evening, nodded toward the officer. The young lady is right, she said. I saw the mix-up too. Another customer sitting near the window slowly raised his coffee cup. I remember seeing those plates switched. I did not think much about it until now. The customer who had made the complaint shifted uncomfortably in his booth and looked down at the table. Ron Haskins rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. The busy evening he had wanted to protect had suddenly become even more complicated. Officer Mercer picked up the receipt from the counter and looked at the order numbers. Then he looked at Keisha. You are absolutely certain? Keisha nodded. Yes, sir. I served both tables myself. Graham Whitaker stood quietly near the front door with his old jacket folded over one arm. He did not interrupt anyone. He did not argue. He simply waited for the facts to catch up with the misunderstanding. Officer Mercer walked over to the customer who had made the complaint and asked a few calm questions. The man hesitated before answering. Little by little, the details changed. He admitted that he had reached for the wrong plate without paying attention. He admitted that Graham had only asked to have the bill checked. The officer looked back toward Graham and offered a polite nod. Sir, it appears there has been a misunderstanding. Graham smiled gently. Those things happen. Ron looked embarrassed. Mister, I should have taken more time to understand what happened. Graham shook his head. Busy nights can make people rush to conclusions. Keisha noticed that Graham could have complained or demanded an apology, but he did neither. He simply walked back to his booth and picked up the coffee that had gone cold during the confusion. Officer Mercer removed his hat for a moment. I appreciate everyone helping clear this up. Keisha smiled politely. I just wanted to make sure the right person was heard. The officer nodded. That matters. The little boy at the family table smiled at his mother. I told you he looked nice, he whispered. His mother smiled back and gently brushed his hair. Maybe we should all wait before making up our minds about people. The atmosphere inside the diner slowly began to change. Forks touched plates again. Coffee was poured. Conversations returned, although they sounded quieter than before. Ron walked over to Graham's booth. "Sir, your meal is on the house tonight." Graham looked surprised. "That is very kind, but I can pay for my dinner." Ron smiled. "Please let us make it right." Graham accepted with a thankful nod. Keisha carried over a fresh cup of coffee and placed it on the table. "I thought you might like a hot one," she said. Graham smiled warmly. "Thank you. You did not have to do that." Keisha laughed softly. "Around here, cold coffee is almost as bad as a wrong bill." Graham chuckled for the first time that evening. The tension seemed to disappear with the sound. As Keisha turned to return to work, Graham spoke again. "Miss, what made you decide to say something when everyone else stayed quiet?" Keisha paused for a second. "My grandmother always told me that the truth does not become less true just because it stands alone." Graham looked at her thoughtfully. "That is a lesson more people should remember." Outside, the rain finally began to slow. The red neon sign reflected across the wet pavement while customers finished their meals and the diner found its familiar rhythm again. Graham quietly finished his coffee, placed enough money on the table to cover the meal and a generous tip, then stood to leave. As he reached the front door, he looked back at Keisha and said with a grateful smile, "Most people noticed what happened tonight, but you were the only one willing to stand up for a stranger, and I hope you never lose that part of yourself." The front door of the Maple Street Diner closed softly behind Graham Whitaker, and for a few seconds everyone inside simply watched the rain through the windows. The red neon sign reflected across the wet parking lot as his old pickup truck slowly disappeared into the storm. Keisha Monroe picked up the empty coffee cup from his booth and noticed the folded bills he had left on the table. There was enough to pay for the meal, the fresh cup of coffee, and a generous tip that made her stop for a second. She smiled quietly and slipped the money into the register. Ron Haskins walked over with a tired sigh. "That was quite a night." Keisha nodded. "Yes, sir." Ron looked at the booth where Graham had been sitting. "I guess I should have listened a little more carefully before assuming the worst." Keisha smiled politely. "We all get busy." Ron looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "You could have stayed quiet. Nobody would have blamed you." Keisha picked up a stack of clean plates. "Maybe not, but I would have blamed myself." Ron did not answer. He simply nodded and walked back toward the kitchen. The dinner rush slowly returned to normal. Linda Hayes stopped by the counter to pay her bill and smiled at Keisha. "Your grandmother must have been a wise woman." Keisha laughed softly. "She had a lot of practice giving advice." Linda pointed toward the front door. "That gentleman seemed grateful." Keisha looked out at the rain. "I hope his evening gets better." Linda smiled. "I think you made sure of that." The little boy from earlier walked by with his parents and waved goodbye. "Mr. was nice," he said with a grin. Keisha waved back. "Yes, he was." After the customers left, the diner became quieter. Coffee pots were cleaned. Tables were wiped down. The smell of fresh bread and pie filled the kitchen. Officer Dale Mercer stepped back inside to return the receipt he had borrowed. He walked over to Keisha. "I wanted to thank you for speaking up." Keisha looked surprised. "I only told the truth." The officer smiled. "Sometimes that is harder than people think." He glanced around the diner. "A lot of folks saw what happened. You were the first one willing to say something." Keisha looked down at the counter. "I just did not think it was fair." Officer Mercer nodded. "Fairness matters." After he left, Ron locked the front door for the night. The storm had almost passed. The clouds were breaking apart, and a few stars were beginning to appear. Keisha finished cleaning Graham's booth and noticed something tucked beneath the sugar container. It was a small folded note. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat and simple. "Thank you for reminding a stranger that honesty still has a place in this world. Do not let anyone change that." There was no signature. Keisha smiled and slipped the note into her apron pocket. Ron walked over carrying a bucket and mop. "Everything all right?" She nodded. "Just a kind message from a customer." Ron chuckled. "Sounds like you earned it." As the staff finished closing the diner, the conversation kept returning to the same question. Who was that man? Linda thought he might have been a traveling salesman. One cook guessed he was a retired teacher. Ron believed he had probably been passing through town on business. Keisha simply shrugged. She did not know anything about Graham Whitaker except what she had seen. He had been polite. He had stayed calm. He had thanked people for their kindness even after a difficult evening. That was enough for her. Outside, the rain finally stopped completely. Keisha stepped into the cool night air and looked across the empty parking lot. She thought about the stranger in the old jacket and the note resting safely in her apron pocket. Her grandmother had always said that doing the right thing did not guarantee a reward. You did it because it was right. Keisha smiled to herself and started walking home beneath the clearing sky, never imagining that before the next evening arrived, the quiet stranger from booth number 7 would return to the Maple Street diner, and the entire town would discover that the simplest customer in the room had been carrying a secret far bigger than anyone could have guessed. The next morning, Keisha Monroe arrived at the Maple Street diner before sunrise, just as she had every weekday for the last 3 years. The small town was still waking up. The sidewalks were quiet, the streetlights had only begun to fade, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery across the street. Keisha unlocked the front door with her apron folded over one arm and smiled at the familiar sight of the empty diner. The booths waited for the breakfast crowd. Coffee machines hummed softly. The note from the stranger the night before was still tucked safely inside her apron pocket. She touched it for a second before starting another ordinary day. Ron Haskins was already in the kitchen checking supplies. "Morning, Keisha." "Morning, sir." Ron smiled. "I have been thinking about last night." Keisha looked up. "About what?" Ron laughed quietly. "About how a young waitress had more courage than a room full of adults." Keisha shook her head. "I only told the truth." Ron nodded. "Maybe that is exactly what courage looks like." Soon the diner filled with regular customers. Linda Hayes stopped by for her usual coffee and oatmeal. The little boy from the previous evening waved from a booth near the window. Officer Dale Mercer even walked in for breakfast and smiled politely at Keisha before taking a seat. The uncomfortable feelings from the night before seemed to have disappeared. It felt like the diner had returned to normal. Around 10 o'clock, a low sound from outside caught everyone's attention. One car pulled into the parking lot. Then another. Then a third dark vehicle parked neatly beside the first two. The conversations inside the diner slowed. Ron looked through the front window. "That is unusual." Linda lowered her newspaper. "Maybe somebody important is coming through town." Keisha poured another cup of coffee and glanced outside without thinking much about it. The doors of the vehicles opened. Several men and women stepped out wearing business clothes and carrying folders. One of them looked around the parking lot before opening the back door of the last vehicle. A familiar man stepped out wearing a tailored navy suit and polished shoes. His hair was neatly combed. His posture was confident. Yet there was no mistaking the warm smile on his face. Keisha nearly dropped the coffee pot. It was Graham Whitaker. The quiet customer from booth number 7 walked toward the diner entrance, while the others followed respectfully behind him. Ron stared in disbelief. Linda lowered her coffee cup. Officer Mercer looked through the window and slowly stood up. The front door opened, and Graham stepped inside. "Good morning, everyone," he said with the same calm voice they had heard the night before. The entire diner seemed to freeze. Graham looked toward Keisha first. "Good morning, Miss Monroe." Keisha smiled nervously. "Good morning, sir." Ron hurried forward. "Welcome back." Graham shook his hand warmly. "Thank you. I hope I am not arriving too early." Ron laughed. "Not at all. Please have a seat." Graham looked around the diner for a moment. "I would like to, but first I should introduce a few people." The men and women behind him stepped inside, carrying folders and briefcases. Graham smiled. "These are members of my executive team." Several customers exchanged confused looks. Ron blinked twice. "Executive team." Graham nodded. "I should probably explain something. My name is Graham Whitaker. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Whitaker Hospitality Group." The coffee cup slipped from Linda's hand onto the table with a soft sound. Officer Mercer looked surprised. Ron's mouth opened, but no words came out. Keisha simply stood behind the counter trying to connect the man in the expensive suit with the quiet stranger who had thanked her for a cup of coffee. Graham looked at her with the same grateful expression he had worn the night before. "I came back because there is something important I need to say," and before another customer could ask a single question, everyone inside the Maple Street diner realized that the stranger they had almost judged by appearances had returned carrying a story far bigger than any of them had imagined. Graham Whitaker stood quietly in the center of the Maple Street diner while the morning crowd stared at him in complete surprise. The expensive navy suit, the polished shoes, and the group of business professionals standing respectfully behind him looked nothing like the simple customer who had sat in booth number 7 the night before wearing an old jacket. Keisha Monroe held the coffee pot in her hands and could not help smiling at the unexpected sight. Graham looked exactly the same, except now everyone else was seeing him differently. Ron Haskins cleared his throat. "Did you say Whitaker Hospitality Group?" Graham nodded politely. "Yes, sir." Ron blinked twice. "The Whitaker Hospitality Group." Graham smiled. "The same one." Linda Hayes lowered her newspaper and whispered to the customer beside her. "That company owns hotels and restaurants all across the country." Officer Dale Mercer stood from his booth and walked over. "Mr. Whitaker, I had no idea." Graham offered his hand. "Neither did I expect you to." The officer smiled and shook it. "I am glad everything worked out the way it did." Graham nodded. "So am I." One of the executives standing behind Graham stepped forward and handed him a folder. Graham thanked her and looked around the diner. "I owe a few people an explanation." The entire room listened. "Last night, I was traveling back from a business meeting and decided to stop here for dinner. I often do that. I enjoy visiting small local restaurants because they remind me where I started." Ron looked confused. "You could have told us who you were." Graham smiled. "I could have, but then I would never know how people treat someone they believe has no influence." The words settled quietly over the diner. Graham continued. "The misunderstanding about the meal was not important. What mattered was seeing how people responded. Some stayed silent because they were uncomfortable. Some rushed to conclusions because it was easier. A few people took the time to pay attention to the facts." Graham looked toward Officer Mercer. "You listened once new information was available." The officer nodded respectfully. Graham looked toward Linda Hayes. "You spoke up when you remembered what happened." Linda smiled. "I figured honesty was worth a try." Then Graham turned toward Keisha. "And one person chose to tell the truth even when it could have made her evening more difficult." Keisha looked down at the counter for a second. "I only did what I thought was right." Graham smiled warmly. "That is exactly why I came back." Ron folded his arms. "Mr. Whitaker, if this visit is about an apology, I want you to know I should have handled things differently." Graham shook his head. "I did not come here looking for apologies. I came because kindness deserves to be recognized just as much as success does." One of the executives opened the folder and handed Graham a document. Graham looked at Keisha. "Miss Monroe, my company has spent the last year searching for restaurants and diners that truly understand hospitality. Fancy buildings are easy to buy. Character is much harder to find." Keisha looked surprised. "I am not sure I understand." Graham laughed softly. "Yesterday, you protected a complete stranger because you believed fairness mattered. You did not know my name. You did not know my job. You did not expect anything in return. That tells me more about leadership than any business meeting I have attended this month." The customers looked from Graham to Keisha and back again. Ron smiled proudly. Keisha stood quietly behind the counter, still trying to understand why the ordinary customer she had served coffee to was standing in the middle of the diner with a team of executives. Graham held the folder in his hands and looked at her with the same grateful expression he had worn the night before. "I have a question for you, Miss Monroe," he said gently. "It is an important question, and I hope you will think about your answer carefully, because what I am about to ask could change far more than your day at the Maple Street Diner." Keisha Monroe looked at Graham Whitaker with complete surprise, while the quiet morning inside the Maple Street Diner seemed to stand still. Customers stopped eating their breakfast. Coffee cups rested halfway to waiting hands. Even the cooks leaned out from the kitchen to see what would happen next. Graham held the folder but did not open it. Instead, he smiled at Keisha with the same calm expression he had worn the night before when she had offered him a fresh cup of coffee. "Miss Monroe," he said, "I have one important question for you." Keisha nodded politely. "Yes, sir." Graham looked around the diner before speaking again. "If you saw the same situation happen tomorrow, with a different stranger and the same risk to yourself, would you still speak up?" Keisha blinked in surprise. She had expected a business question or perhaps another thank you. Instead, she thought about the answer for only a second. "Yes, sir." Graham smiled. "May I ask why?" Keisha folded her hands together. "Because the truth should not depend on who the person is. If someone deserves fairness, they deserve it whether they are rich, poor, famous, or completely unknown." A warm smile spread across Graham's face. "That was the answer I hoped to hear." One of the executives standing behind him quietly nodded. Graham opened the folder and removed a single document. "My company believes that hospitality is not just about serving food or running hotels. It is about making people feel respected. Last night, you showed that better than any presentation I have attended in years." Ron Haskins listened carefully from behind the counter. Linda Hayes smiled proudly from her booth. Officer Dale Mercer crossed his arms and waited to hear the rest of the story. Graham continued. Whitaker Hospitality Group has been visiting small businesses across the country looking for people with leadership qualities. We can teach management skills. We can teach accounting and operations. We cannot teach honesty. We cannot teach kindness. Keisha looked at the document in Graham's hands. Sir, I am only a waitress. Graham laughed softly. Yesterday, you were a waitress. Last night, you became the person who reminded an entire diner to pay attention before judging someone. That sounds like leadership to me. Graham handed the document to Keisha. She looked down and saw the company logo across the top of the page. The offer was simple. It invited her to join a paid management development program with Whitaker Hospitality Group while continuing her education and professional training. Keisha looked up in disbelief. Are you serious? Graham smiled. Very serious. The room filled with quiet excitement. Ron walked over and looked at the paper. Keisha, this is an incredible opportunity. Linda wiped a happy tear from her eye. I knew good things would come from doing the right thing. Officer Mercer smiled. Looks like honesty pays better than people think. Keisha looked back at Graham. Sir, I did not help you because I wanted something in return. Graham nodded. I know. That is exactly why I trust you. The executive team smiled at the exchange. Graham looked around the diner one more time. I did not come back to reward one good deed. I came back because communities become stronger when good people are encouraged to keep doing good things. Ron folded his arms and smiled proudly at Keisha. We are all proud of you. Keisha looked around the diner she had worked in for years. She thought about the early mornings, the long shifts, the regular customers, and the note still resting safely inside her apron pocket. Graham noticed her hesitation. You do not have to answer today, he said kindly. Talk to your family. Think about your future. Whatever you decide, I hope you never change the person you were last night. Keisha smiled gratefully. Thank you, sir. Graham reached for the front door and paused before leaving. One more thing, he said. I have another surprise to share with everyone here, and I think it will mean just as much to this diner as the opportunity one offered you. The customers looked at one another with curious smiles, and for the second day in a row, the quiet stranger who had walked into Maple Street Diner seemed ready to change the lives of the people inside, with nothing more than gratitude and a simple belief that kindness should never go unnoticed. Keisha Monroe stood quietly behind the counter with the folder from Whitaker Hospitality Group still resting in her hands. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Maple Street Diner, making the polished tables shine while every customer seemed to be waiting for Graham Whitaker to continue. The surprise job opportunity had already changed the mood of the room, but Graham had promised there was one more thing he wanted to say. He smiled at Keisha and then looked around at the familiar faces inside the diner. Ron Haskins stood with his hands folded across his apron. Linda Hayes leaned forward from her booth. Officer Dale Mercer sipped his coffee but never took his eyes off the conversation. Graham looked toward his executive team and nodded. One of the women stepped forward and handed him another folder. Graham placed it gently on the counter. Last night, he said, I saw something that reminded me why small places matter. I saw a waitress who protected a stranger because it was the right thing to do. I saw customers willing to admit they had missed something important and then speak honestly. I saw a police officer take the time to listen to new facts. I even saw a busy manager admit he could have handled things differently. Graham smiled at Ron, who nodded with a grateful expression. Graham continued, My company has spent years building hotels and restaurants, but the most valuable thing we have ever found is good character. He opened the folder and placed a document on the counter where everyone could see it. Whitaker Hospitality Group would become a community partner for the Maple Street Diner. The partnership would help renovate the building, improve equipment, support employee training, and create educational opportunities for local workers who wanted to build careers in hospitality. Ron looked at the papers and could hardly believe what he was reading. You want to invest in this diner? Graham nodded. I want to invest in the people who make this place special. The customers smiled and began whispering to one another. Linda clapped her hands together. That is wonderful news. Graham looked toward Ron. There is only one condition. Ron smiled nervously. I was wondering when that part would come. Graham laughed softly. The condition is simple. Promise me that every customer who walks through these doors will be treated with patience and fairness, no matter who they are or what they look like. Ron extended his hand immediately. You have my word. Graham shook it warmly. Officer Mercer stood and smiled. Sounds like a good agreement to me. Graham turned back to Keisha. None of this would have happened without you. Keisha looked surprised. Sir, everyone helped. Graham nodded. They did. But someone had to be first. Someone had to make the room stop and think. The little boy from the previous evening walked into the diner with his parents and smiled when he saw Graham. Mister, are you staying for breakfast today? Graham laughed. I think I should. The entire diner smiled with him. Keisha picked up a coffee pot and walked toward Graham's favorite booth. The same booth where everything had started the night before. She poured him a fresh cup of coffee. Graham thanked her and reached into his pocket. Keisha shook her head with a smile. This one is on the house. Graham looked around the diner and laughed softly. Yesterday, I offered to pay for my meal, and today you are offering me coffee for free. Keisha smiled. Around here, kindness has a way of coming back. Graham looked at the people gathered inside the small diner and realized that the greatest surprise of his journey had never been the misunderstanding over a dinner bill. It had been discovering that a simple roadside restaurant was filled with ordinary people willing to become a better community once one brave waitress reminded them what fairness looked like. And as the morning crowd shared breakfast and conversation together, everyone could feel that the Maple Street Diner had become something even more valuable than a place to eat. The breakfast crowd at the Maple Street Diner slowly returned to their meals, but nobody could stop smiling after Graham Whitaker announced his partnership with the small restaurant. Sunlight filled the windows, and for the first time in a long while, the old diner seemed brighter than it had the day before. Ron Haskins walked through the dining room shaking hands with customers, still trying to believe that an ordinary evening had turned into an opportunity for the entire community. Keisha Monroe stood behind the counter pouring fresh coffee, while the folded note Graham had left her the previous night remained safely tucked inside her apron pocket. Graham sat in booth number 7 with a simple breakfast in front of him, enjoying the same peaceful meal that had almost been ruined by a misunderstanding only hours earlier. The little boy from the neighboring table walked over with a shy smile. Mr. Whitaker, are you really a big boss? Graham laughed softly. Some people call me that. The little boy looked at Keisha. She was the boss last night. The entire diner laughed, including Graham himself. I think you might be right, he said. Keisha smiled and shook her head. I was just doing my job. Graham looked at her. No, you were doing something much more important. You reminded people that character matters more than titles. Ron carried a framed photograph from the office and placed it on the counter. It showed the Maple Street Diner when it first opened many years ago. My father used to say this place was built to feed people and make them feel welcome. Somewhere along the way, I got so busy that I forgot the second part. Graham stood and looked at the picture. Then maybe yesterday was a good reminder for all of us. Officer Dale Mercer finished his breakfast and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he shook Graham's hand and then Keisha's. Thank you both. One of you reminded me to listen carefully, and the other reminded me to stay patient. Linda Hayes smiled from her usual booth. I have lived in this town for 40 years, and I think this little diner taught the biggest lesson I have seen in a long time. Graham looked toward Keisha one final time. Miss Monroe, have you thought about the opportunity we discussed? Keisha nodded. I have. Graham waited quietly. Keisha smiled. I would like to accept, but only if I can keep coming back here to visit. Ron laughed. You had better. You are part of this family now. Graham extended his hand. Then welcome to Whitaker Hospitality Group. Keisha shook his hand while the customers around them applauded. The executive team smiled, but Graham raised his hand gently for one last thought. I hope everyone here remembers something. Yesterday, I walked into this diner wearing an old jacket. Nobody knew my name or my job. One person decided that fairness was more important than appearances. That decision changed my day. Today, kindness changed an entire community. The room grew quiet as people thought about his words. Keisha reached into her apron pocket and touched the folded note one more time. Her grandmother had always said that the right thing to do would not always be the easy thing to do, but it would always be worth doing. Graham picked up his jacket, the same old jacket he had worn the night before, and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, he turned back with a smile. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Monroe. Keisha smiled back. You are always welcome at booth number 7. Graham stepped outside into the warm Georgia sunshine while the customers returned to their breakfasts and the Maple Street Diner settled into another ordinary day that no one there would ever forget. Some people would remember the businessman. Some would remember the surprise opportunity. Others would remember the partnership that helped a small diner grow. But the story people would tell for years was much simpler than that. A stranger needed someone to tell the truth. A young waitress decided to speak, and one honest act of kindness proved that the strongest power in the world is not money or success, but the courage to stand up for another person when nobody else will.